All right, Coach Tony, Wrestling Podium Performance here, and today I'm going to be talking about the 3 primary reasons why elite level female track and field athletes are seeing a rise in stress fractures these days. So the 3 main reasons are inappropriate diet and dieting, number 2 being inappropriate volume and intensity loads, and then the third one, which is the actual underlying cause, is coaching decisions. So in order to get to number 3, we have to first understand number 1 and 2. So first one being dieting and diets and doing it inappropriately. In the sport of track and field, we all fall under the guys that weight and the scale weight is everything for performance. My race weight or my competition weight is this. The problem with that is track and field is not a weight class sport like mixed martial arts, boxing. So using a strict weight limit doesn't actually make much sense, especially when you consider there's 2 fundamental seasons to an entire track and field season. You have the indoor season and then you have the outdoor season. The outdoor season is where everybody really makes their name. That's where you get the Olympics, the world championships, like the big world championships. That's where you get to make your money really. Yes, indoors there is some money making, but it's not the same as outdoors. There's less spectators, there's less events, there's less opportunity, less sponsors. So one of the reasons why we've run into the problem of bad diets, especially when we get to outdoors and dieting, is that scale weight. And on the indoor season side of things, that's usually where the loading in terms of weight room, volume on the track are all fairly high. So a lot of athletes are able to put on muscle mass during the winter. And then they get to the outdoor season and they start to think, oh, my competition weight, just for arbitrary sakes, is 130 pounds. But right now I'm sitting at 135 pounds. So in order for me to compete, I have to drop 5 pounds and I have to do it quickly because qualification period outdoors isn't that long. And in order for me to qualify to make a national team or nationals, I have to run, jump, throw a certain metric in order for it to count. Now, when you consider as we age, we're able to put on a little bit more muscle as we age. We're able to get a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, faster. But one of the issues that arises, particularly on the female side, is that scale weight and falling in love with what that number is. Say the year before you were competing well at 130 pounds, so you think you have to get back to that. But if you just spent the entire winter putting on a couple of pounds of muscle mass, trying to cut all of that off isn't actually going to serve you well. It's actually going to be to your detriment. And then because you're dieting and you're in a hypocaloric state, you're then going to be running into the problem of not ingesting enough food, enough calories in general. Particularly, we have 3 macronutrients we need. We have protein, the nutrient for tissue recovery and repair, carbohydrate, the performance macronutrient, and then we have fats or lipids, which is your hormonal health macronutrient as well as an energy source. So when we cut out a lot of calories, one or all 3 of these usually suffers. And the 2 that end up suffering a lot of times for females is they cut out their fat sources and they cut out protein because they think, oh, I need to just get down in weight and this is causing me to hold on to weight. So if I just cut calories drastically, I'm going to get down to the weight. But unlike men, women have this time of month when they menstruate, which is when they actually show that they're in proper health. If a female athlete is menstruating on a regular cycle, her body is actually healthier. If she isn't, that's sign number 1 that something isn't right. The second reason behind all of that is that fats, as I said, are hormonal health. So in order for our bodies to produce testosterone, progesterone, estrogens, you actually need saturated fat in the diet. Without that saturated fat, your body's not going to be producing this. And because women already have lower bone mineral density than men, lower muscle mass, it's going to put them more at risk of stripping their bone minerals and their muscle mass in order to feed the body and for it to recover. But I'll use a bucket analogy. If you take a bucket, poke a bunch of holes in the bottom of that bucket, fill it up with water, it's going to start to drain. Now, if you're not filling it with enough calories or water, or for the bucket, water in this case, that's just going to keep draining out until there's nothing left. The same goes for your body. If you keep depleting it too much and there's nothing left, it breaks. It has no other option because you're putting it under stresses. On top of that, because you are stressing the body by dieting, and then as we get into on point 2, your cortisol levels, the number 1 catabolic hormone in the body whose only job essentially is to break down various tissues to feed the engine of the body to ensure that adequate energy is being mobilized for the body to function and survive. But if you're in a chronically hypocaloric state, you're going to end up, whenever you train and compete, jacking up your cortisol levels, and you're not going to be bringing them back down. Great thing to do after training, have carbohydrates. It's a shunt for cortisol, and having vitamin C. That also helps to shunt and shut down cortisol production so that you can get into that rest, relaxation, and recovery state. Now, the second big reason why female athletes are more prone to stress fractures, particularly in the outdoor season for track and field, is inappropriate increases in volume and intensity. Now, as the training season goes, you start with high volume and you move to higher intensity. So it's a continuum. So in the fall, winter, the volume is much higher while the intensity is commensurately lower. And then as you get to outdoors, these kind of alternate places. As the intensity ramps up, the volume must drop off. If it doesn't drop off and you keep them both very high, you're running the risk for overuse injuries, soft tissue damage, which is your joints, your muscles, as well as, because the high intensity is going to be much more force or much more impact on the lower limbs, your foot, thigh, shin area, which is where female athletes typically get their stress fractures. And you compound this with 0.1 of dieting, and you've depleted the bone mineral density. When you put these two factors together, boom, now you're running the risk for the bone to actually start to crumble and break down. And then when you're putting the forces of a competition or high intensity, high volume days on the track in, you're putting yourself at an increased risk to get injured from stress fractures. I've noticed this season especially, there's been multiple Canadian, American, and various other national team level athletes on the female side getting stress fractures, and it's typically in their feet, the shin, and in much more rare cases in the thigh, which takes a lot more trauma overall because the femur, the thigh bone, is very large. It's one of the biggest bones in our entire body. It can take a lot of force, but if you chronically deplete the bone mineral density of it by chronically dieting and increasing your training intensity and volume, instead of having those kind of inversely relate to each other, you run the risk for even your femur to start to break down and crack. One of the other things to keep in mind when we get outdoors in the track and field season is that competitions are much more intense than indoors. You have the elements to deal with. You also have, there's typically much more travel involved. The training surfaces are very hard outdoors now with Mondo surfaces. You have the new quote unquote super spikes, the carbon plate spikes. So these are all returning more energy into the body. And as I was saying, where there's more and more stress fractures occurring in the female athletes especially, the main places that we see them, as I said, the foot, so that comes from force return from the ground, your ground force reactions, as well as just the overall volume and intensity. The events where you're typically seeing these occur lately are in the 400-meter hurdles, pole vault, and other jump events. These events have somewhat of a constant kind of force projection in them, and then all of a sudden there's a very intense step, whether it's going over the hurdle, jumping, or trying to vault. So in many of these cases, the takeoff leg for the athlete is what ends up getting injured because that's the one that's actually taking a disproportionately higher amount of force and repetitions at those disproportionately high forces. Now, as I said in the beginning, all of this boils down to point number 3, coaching. A lot of the elite track and field coaches in the world, I'm saying this as a male, are men, and they don't actually understand that there is a difference between male and female physiology in terms of what they can handle on the track. There is what's taught in universities, the female athlete triad, which boils down to amenorrhea is the big underlying cause of it, but it's also the intensity and volume load and the lack of rest compounded with the dieting. And because coaches put pressure on an athlete, especially when they take the scale out, let's see what your weight is, or they tell them weigh yourself every morning, and the female athlete doesn't see that their weight necessarily is going down or that they're not at their competition weight, you run into the risk of now, oh, we have to do more work. One of the biggest problems in sport across the board is, oh, more work, more. More is better is the big thought process. But in reality, it's not actually the best thing. The lowest effective dose is going to be more beneficial than just running the athlete into the ground. And once we get outdoors, and if you are ramping up the intensity without dropping the volume, you're not recovering the same way. As I said, under the diet portion, cortisol levels go up. That singular hormone breaks down every tissue in the body when it interacts with it, whether it's muscle tissue, fat tissue, joint tissue, or your bone tissue. So if it starts breaking down the bone tissues, that's when you start to run the risk for stress fractures. The whole purpose of me making this video was simply because I know strength and conditioning coaches had a gap in the information, and you don't actually have to know the sport of track and field because it's universal across the board, whether you're talking volleyball, soccer, football, gymnastics. All of these sports have very high forces involved. You're coming off of hard surfaces, or in the terms of soccer or football, you're running into having impacts with another player. So all of this can be transferred regardless of the sport in question. The only time that you don't really have to worry about it is swimming because it's not really a high impact environment, we hope. So as I was saying, the three main reasons why female track and field athletes at the elite level are having a higher incidence of stress fractures are inappropriate dieting and diets, inappropriate volume and intensity, as well as coaching decisions that are being made. One of the points I also made earlier was the new carbon spike footwear that is available to elite track and field athletes today. When you have a higher force return, you're going to have more energy returned into the bones and the joints of the body. If you're returning greater amounts of force and you're already predisposing yourself to get injured, the risk for the injury also increases. So I'll just take a moment here to say, if you like what you hear here, like and subscribe below. And remember, Wrestling Podium Performance, embrace your potential.